It's my pleasure now to bring up a team and to talk about, I think, something that's very important, something that I find kind of confusing sometimes, and having been through it, it's interesting, but the whole issue of disability decisions and applying for SSDI, I'm pleased to bring up to the stage Jonathan Rodis and Kathleen Kane. Jonathan was in management at Northwestern University, MBA in the Executive Management at Suffolk University. He has over 20 years of experience in business management consulting, 8 years in senior management positions. Jonathan does, in fact, have a disability, so he clearly understands all the issues that are faced, and he is very fortunate to be married to Kathleen, who is his wife, who is a disability attorney that represents clients with genetic disorders before the Social Security Administration. If you've ever been through that process, the typical answer when you go for Social Security is no. The second time is no. Third time is no. And so it's very beneficial to have people that are knowledgeable about how to answer questions and how to approach that thing. So let me introduce Jonathan and Kathleen. Thank you, guys.
Good morning, everyone. Jonathan and I are pleased to be here, and hopefully we can provide some important information. We have nothing to disclaim, and no personal financial interests or relationships to disclose. The first thing that we're going to talk about is just the considerations in applying. And as was stated, Jonathan actually is disabled from a genetic disorder, so I think he's most appropriate to speak to some of the things that have to go in just to the decision.
I'm going to shift spots here for a second. Kathleen, why don't you come over here? These three categories are on the screen here actually are very important categories. First, of course, being health considerations. That's actually one of the main reasons why you file for disability in the first place, whether it be for a child or for an adult. What people struggle with, which I struggle with too, was dealing with all the different problems with health. What do I do now? What can I do now? How can I deal with it? And that's what we're going to get to when I talk about emotional considerations. But the health considerations mostly is how it affects you or how it affects your child. The need for testing, the need for support, the need for awareness. It can be very consuming. Financial considerations is, most of you probably definitely know, it's very hard. Because with Social Security, depending on whether it be SSI or SSDI, which we will get into later, it greatly affects your situation. If you are an adult and you are working and realizing that you may have to give up that ability to work, that in itself is very hard financially. What do I do? And that's part of what I do as an advocate, is I help people walk through the process, even determining whether or not to file or not to file. As an adult, I help people with that decision as well. The biggest category, I say this for last, is the emotional considerations, which I have actually feel is probably the most important of actually the three, even though you would think money would be the most important thing. Emotionally, to file for disability, especially for an adult who has a career, it's very, very difficult. And I know that to be something that people struggle with. I struggle with it. I definitely filed far too late. I waited almost 11 years before I actually decided to file because I didn't want to give up my career. I know a lot of friends of mine who have ataxia that are in the same boat. They have kind of put it off, and then it gets to a point where you can no longer put it off because you may be degenerating, your body even further is degenerating because of the fact that you're working. So as an advocate, that's one of the things I do, is I help people try to make that decision or make it more comfortable to deal with making the decision.
One of the things, other than Social Security, you should also look at initially, if you are working still, is what kind of programs your company has. A lot of companies have short-term and long-term disability policies, and a lot of times they actually would kick in sooner than your Social Security disability. Once you get both, there is going to be a little bit of an offset, but I think it's important to know exactly what you're entitled to through your current workplace. I think you can talk to this.
Preparing to file, when I started the process myself, I'm very, very lucky to be married to a disability attorney, so that definitely helped me, but there was a lot of things other than having her in my back, was knowing what to do. And when I started the process, it became apparent that I know I had to help people in the future because I had really no support, and there really wasn't much out there to help. A lot of times people we told, go talk to Social Security, they'll tell you, well, they don't tell you anything. They just basically tell you, here's the application, and this is what you need to do. One of the things that can help you when you are contemplating the process, if it's for a child or if it's for yourself, is to keep a journal of things that affect you, how you are limited in doing certain tasks of your life. And it's also a good way to kind of judge for yourself is how things are, if they are degenerating. It's also important to Social Security to see what your day-to-day life is like, other than the material that they're going to receive from the doctors or from your own, your own mouth or the child's mouth. It's a good thing to have. Preparing your physicians for filing is super important because people ask me what are the do's and don'ts of getting approved, and I say you really need physicians to support you. So they have to understand what you're going through, and they need to understand the total limitation that you have and what your life is really like, and that's what I had done. I sort of stumbled into it because my doctors, they cared, but they didn't understand what I was going through, so I had to walk through what it's like to live in my body. And that's what works for you, is when your doctors can really understand what it's like to live in your body, and then they can transfer that into the medical records.
So there's two major programs through the government, SSI and SSDI. SSDI is for someone who has worked and who was put into the system. So if you're working, you know that every week out of your paycheck, money goes to Social Security. It's for retirement, but it can also be for the disability. If you have not worked or if you're a child, you could be eligible for SSI. SSI doesn't mean that you had to work at all, actually, but it is income and asset-based. So what that means is that you have to have a low household income and no assets in order to apply for or be approved for supplemental security income. The filing process, it can actually be done online. You could go to www.ssa.gov, and there's a disability application link that can take you through everything. Or you can make an appointment with your local office, go and sit down with someone, and they can go through everything they need and all the information that's important. You will need, whichever way you do this, is to have all of your medical history, doctors, medications, procedures, and your last 15 years of work history, because they're the information that they're going to need in order to initiate your process. And why don't you just tell the story about when you applied?
I'm laughing because when I applied, I had a very lucrative career, and giving that up was so hard. And when I decided, because I was a people person, I thought I would go into Social Security and talk to them and kind of walk them through what was my disability. Because as you all saw me walk up here, I'm not in a wheelchair, and I don't have any crutches. I don't have anything to aid me. But my problem is basically, and I'll tell you in a second what it is by my description. But I went into the office and I sat down with the Social Security. Before I sat down with Social Security, the administrator, the clerk, he said to me, "You're disabled?" And I felt my fingers clenching into a fist, and I was about to punch him, and I decided that wasn't going to help me with getting approved. So I said, something inside me, my brain said, I said to him, think about the last time, I'm going to tell you how I feel. I said, this is part of it. Think about the last time you had a bad cold. I said, think about how your body ached. You had fatigue. You really felt lousy. You probably didn't want to go to wherever you were going, school or work, but you did anyway. I says, I feel like that 2 days a week. And this is only part of what my disability is. This is what I told him. I said, I let him think about it. And I said, now think about the last time you had a bad flu. You had hardly any energy in your body. You were very, very weak. You were in a lot of pain. You could barely make it out of bed, barely make it to the bathroom. Walking down a corridor, you'd probably walk into a wall or, lose your balance. I said, that's how I feel 4 to 5 days a week. And I said, that's just part of my disability. His face turned totally red, and from then on, he treated me like a human being, and he understood. So it's really important to get the message across how you're affected, not only with your doctors, but when you're dealing with Social Security. You want to tell them exactly what you're going through, how limited you are, and make sure that they understand. And I'd be glad to help anyone, not only here at the conference, but going forward if you have any questions. I'm a national advocate, and I don't charge anything for what I do. And the National Ataxia Foundation has all our contact information. And also we want to thank them, too. I didn't mention that. Sorry. Thank you for inviting us. Kathleen.
So we put together, John and I, a little list of things that we felt were important in the beginning process. As was mentioned, it's difficult to get a decision early. Usually first time is no, second time is no, and then actually have to go in front of a judge. So we just kind of put together some things that we thought would help to maybe get a person approved initially.
Yeah, so this, and she doesn't ever give herself any credit, but she was a big factor in making this list. But the filling out the forms, it may sound like, oh, just filling out a form. I tell people what you do and what you don't do on those forms can hurt you. When you're filling out a form for SSI or SSDI, you want to make sure you answer every question they've asked, but specifically utilize the words limitation, whether it be for a child or for an adult, for yourself. You want to make sure that you have emphasized how you are limited, because that's really a key word for the Social Security Administration. Also, how you fill out is all up to you. I chose to go in, as you heard my story, which, in a way I sort of, it wasn't exactly the greatest move for me, but it worked out. State funding programs, every state is different. Every state is like its own government. I mean, it's its own country, I should say. So you really should get to know your own state and see what's there. There are other state aid programs in some states. Some states there really isn't anything. So it's also always good to know what you have in the state. And a good person to talk to is your local, state, and federal representatives, your politicians, believe it or not, in this crazy political world of ours. You need to use them as your representatives. And they should know what's going on in your state. Support letters are really, well, Kathy, you want to talk about support letters?
Doctor support is extremely important, as John mentioned earlier. What I find is I have certain forms that I use, and I know a lot of lawyers use, that actually go through what your limitations are. For instance, how long you can stand in a day, how long you can walk in a day, if you would be not able to concentrate because of pain or fatigue. And if you can have a doctor fill out one of these forms, it can be extremely helpful. A lot of people will say, well, my doctor won't write a letter. That's okay, because the Social Security Administration isn't interested in whether or not your doctor thinks you're disabled. That determination is left up to the Social Security Administration. What they are interested in is if your doctor can say what your limitations are, specifically if they're backed up by objective testing. So, that can be extremely important. The daily journal you talked about before, and, that's, you can go through that.
Sorry. I want to also mention what she was talking about as far as there's a thing called the residual functional capacity form. And that's something that every doctor should fill out for the patient, or a doctor to fill out, because that talks about really what is your residual function. What can you not perform? That's very crucial. As far as I'm looking at the list here, research. I mean, the National Ataxia Foundation has a lot of information, and they've done an incredible amount of work to get three of the different ataxias listed on the compassionate allowance list, which speed tracks ataxia through the system, or it helps in the process. But I have found today, which was a little alarming, that there's been cases people have been having a hard time getting disability, even if they have even stuff that's on the allowance list. So that's something that I'm going to help address, because that shouldn't happen. between with everything that we've been talking about, the residual functional capacity form, to keeping a journal, and the processes that I've learned to do and created, that should not happen. So another aspect is, like I said, getting the legislators involved and letting them know, because that judicially should not be happening. As far as approved cases in the state, sorry, now I'm hogging the mic. I usually blame her for hogging the microphone when we speak. It's the approved cases in the state. What I meant by that is if you know of anyone that has been approved and they have someone that, maybe an attorney that they've had, it would be good to talk to them. But I always tell people, don't hire a lawyer up front. You can get it. Someone like myself, I'm a free advocate. I can get you approved without having any money to go to an attorney. Kathleen is an attorney, but she only takes clients, so she would rather take clients when you really need a lawyer is at the hearing and when you have to go in front of a judge. You don't really need them up to that point.
So early approval is possible. Social Security has something called the listing of impairments. And this is a list of disorders, conditions that if you meet the impairment definition perfectly, you could possibly get approved right away. These are a couple that I've used with Ataxia cases. But again, it can be up to interpretation whether or not you meet these listings. And John also mentioned compassionate allowances. These are supposed to speed track certain types of ataxia, and spinocerebellar ataxia and Friedreich's ataxia are on that list. So again, that might have to get approved quickly. If you're not approved quickly, John mentioned this term before, residual functional capacity. So the Social Security Administration is told to look at what you're left with, what you can do. So based on all of your impairments put together, what is it you can still do, if anything? And it's important, by the way, to list from the beginning all of your impairments. So for instance, not just your physical ones, but a lot of people with chronic pain also suffer from depression. So that's something that should also be evaluated and taken into consideration with whether or not, you can work a 40-hour workday or work week, and that's what the standard basically is. So there's several phases. Initially you apply. In about 3 months you'll get an answer. Again, a lot of times that answer is no. Then you go into what we call a reconsideration phase, which is basically just someone else at Social Security looking at your case and determining whether or not the first decision was correct or not. That's usually another 3 months. If you're denied, then you go into what we refer as the hearing phase. So you're asking for a hearing in front of an administrative law judge. That can take up to a year, okay? So already you're talking about a year and a half of waiting if you're lucky. The hearing is probably the most important part of the process, and it is when most people are actually approved. We'll talk a little bit about the hearing in a second. If you're denied at the hearing, you can go to an appeals council, and if you're denied there, you can go to the United States District Court. You could literally go to the Supreme Court, but with these type of appeals, you have to have a very, very legal issue, and obviously appeals are not granted. So your hearing is really the most important part of this process and your best chance for approval. So as I said, the hearing is in front of an administrative law judge. It's somewhat informal, so it's not in a courtroom. It's in a room, there's a clerk, there's the judge. There's usually a vocational expert whose job it will be during the hearing to determine whether or not there are jobs that you can do based on your testimony and the medical records. And the judge will ask the vocational expert what we call hypothetical questions to determine, based, again, on what your impairments are, whether or not you could do certain jobs. Sometimes there's a medical expert. That's not as common as having a vocational expert, but usually when there's a condition that is, somewhat rare, they may have a medical expert. However, when I say expert, they're not necessarily an expert in what your condition is. Usually they're your typical primary care physician, and the extent to which they know of your disorder is sometimes questionable, which is why the administrative hearing is really the time to have a lawyer, because your lawyer is going to be able to cross-examine the vocational expert and the medical expert. And truthfully, when I have a medical expert, I usually become extremely knowledgeable about whatever the person's disorder is that I'm representing, so I'm comfortable cross-examining them. Preparation is very important, obviously. Your testimony, you being able to explain to a judge what you go through on a daily basis, why you can't work 8 hours, 5 days a week. You have to be able to articulate that. And again, a lawyer could help you with prepping for that. You can have witnesses. Obviously, if you have your spouse or, someone close to you, it can be said that they're biased, of course. But if you have, in my case, what I do when I represent someone is if I have a witness, the person who's claiming for benefits who is not able to articulate what they go through, sometimes someone that lives with them, can be effective as a witness.
We're going to get to that last bit. You can jump to
This one?
yeah. Is that the last one? Yeah. Sorry about that. I want to mention a couple of things. I sometimes get brain fog, so I just came back to a few points. One is that the support groups in each state are really important to be part of and involved with, because there you can get a lot of information and support as far as dealing with disability even after you get it, because that's part of the problem. And this slide says this is a new beginning, because a lot of people feel like I did. I felt my life was over when I filed. I thought, what am I going to do now? Well, actually, your life is actually beginning. It's just beginning another page. There's so many things you can do, as I'm actually proof of that. So I want to just end with by basically saying that all of these things have answers, and all of these things have solutions and ways to get dealing with an illness is not easy, as I know, and as you know, but it's good to know what the steps are to get support. And you have supports within your state, utilize them. You have people within your state and support groups that want to help and want to help each other, and a lot of times I get a lot of help from people in my own groups and chapters, because I need that. So please take advantage of that, and thank you very much.